I would like to say a few words at the beginning. So I think this year, in which we remembered 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, it showed us very strongly that the history, especially of our part of Europe, is not over. And first of all, Belarusians are fighting the Lukashenko regime for freedom and democracy. I would like to remind that nearly 1,000 people are detained in jails of Stalinist conditions, and the card sentence are draconian. In Moscow, a criminal trial is being held for the liquidation of Memorial, an independent and legendary institution that is crucial to Russian as well as Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, Ukrainian history, culture of memory. And yes, the history is not over, but we can also see very well how knowledge of the 20th century and independent research into 20th century history are also becoming crucial for today's politics and defending democracy. And the memory of the Gulag or of Katyn, but also the identity of the Belarusian opposition, everything is becoming an object of real, terrible repression and violence. And perhaps it's in this way that today we are discovering that history really does happen and that history really does matter. And yes, so thank you very much for being here, and thank you to my deputy Mateusz Falkowski. Yes, I wish you an interesting
discussion. Many thanks. I would like to present our first speaker. As already Hanna said, we will start with a statement by Nikita Pietrow, vice-chairman of Memorial. And Nikita didn't make it to Berlin today as Gabriele, however, on different reasons, but we recorded his speech, and the story told by, or statement told, message told by historian and activist about the Memorial Association and the policy of Russian authorities provides us with an important context for our conversation. Then Maria and Jadwiga will present the thesis of their report, and then we'll start a discussion together with also with Juliane Fürst. And Hanna told us that this work of Memorial is important for Russians, but also for other nations of Eastern Europe. But I would add that not only for Polish people or Lithuanians or Estonians, but also, generally speaking, access to archives and freedom of science is quite important for democracy as such. And Nikita Pietrow is Russian historian and human rights activist, vice-chairman of Association Memorial, which investigates, first of all, Stalinist crimes. He's expert on post-Soviet archives, and he wrote, among others, about the so-called Polish operation of the NKVD and on the perpetrators of the Katyn massacre. Please, we listen to Nikita Pietrow.
Я рад обратиться к участникам дискуссии о исторической политике и тенденции, которые берут начало в середине 90-х, когда государство стало год за годом все активнее и активнее вмешиваться в политику историческую, в историю, которая собственно говоря, государству хотелось выстроить по неким патриотическим и с точки зрения Кремля правильным лекалам. И эта тенденция сейчас нарастает, и нельзя еще сказать, что окончательно выстроились все те приоритеты и все те догмы и нормативы, которыми должны руководствоваться историки. Но, тем не менее, можно уже сейчас сказать, что с каждым годом эта историческая политика приобретает все более чудовищные и отвратительные черты, потому что прежде всего она замешана на активной ксенофобии, на выстраивании барьеров между Россией и Западом, на подчеркивание какой-то особой исторической судьбы России, и это на самом деле граничит вот с каким-то агрессивным национализмом. Ну и понятно, что в исторической политике берется из истории только то, что служит сегодняшним сиюминутным целям государства, и историков заставляют именно сквозь эту призму смотреть на пройденный нашей страной исторический путь развития. Но идеологическая линия, она, конечно же, включает, и мы это видим уже сегодня, оправдание агрессии, оправдание силовых приемов в международной политике, диктат воли Москвы своим соседям и, наконец, опасное балансирование на грани войны, что сейчас стало просто даже обыденностью. То, чего раньше стеснялись, теперь не стесняются и говорят прямо, и грозят вооруженной силой по отношению своих соседей. История перестает быть исторической наукой как таковой, она становится дисциплиной, которая обслуживает власть, дисциплиной, которая должна воспитывать грядущие поколения, подрастающее поколение, и это на самом деле видно хотя бы из того, что устанавливаются даже уголовные нормы преследования тех, кто в истории, в оценках исторических событий, советской в том числе истории, придерживается других отличных от взглядов, отличных от тех, которые диктует Кремль и которые Кремль хотел бы навязать. Это касается, например, очень ясной и четкой темы, так называемый культ победы 1945 года, когда государство яростно преследует всех тех, кто в чем-то сомневается или не готов разделить те оценки, которые официальные исторические институты уже внедряют в литературу и в школьные курсы, в школьные программы учебников истории. Общество «Мемориал», в котором я работаю, является старейшей некоммерческой и негосударственной организацией на территории России. Оно возникло еще в советское время, оно было очень широким и сильным движением, которое ставило перед собой целью создать библиотеку, архив, материалы, изучать историю репрессий коммунистического тоталитарного периода. Сегодня государство не отрицает репрессии 30-х, не репрессии советского времени, но не хочет драматизировать эту тему. Драматизировать, конечно, в кавычках. Государство хочет некого, в кавычках, взвешенного подхода, когда будут прежде всего выпячиваться положительные черты пройденного исторического пути и замалчиваться те тяжелые моменты в нашей истории, те преступные моменты. Государство не готово дать оценку советскому прошлому как преступному. И вот в этом отношении атака на мемориал, попытка прекратить деятельность нашего общества, это, конечно же, лежит в русле общей тенденции Кремля бороться с любыми независимыми, некоммерческими, неправительственными организациями, которые имеют свою точку зрения. Кремлю нужно, чтобы были только зависимые от него и в финансовом, и в идейном отношении организации. Пусть даже они будут не государственными, но они должны финансироваться только Кремлем, и это есть путь к установлению единомыслия в России. Это одна из целей, кстати говоря, исторической политики, чтобы все думали одинаково. Хотя по Конституции у нас нет никакой идеологии, у нас не должно быть этой государственной и навязанной сверху идеологии. Но тем не менее, мы видим, что по факту продолжается борьба с гражданским обществом, и эта борьба пока государством ведется настолько сильно и настолько последовательно, что многие люди стали бояться, и в душах российских ученых, историков вновь поселился страх. Они боятся браться за многие темы. Мы, конечно, посмотрим, чем все это закончится, но, тем не менее, общество «Мемориал» сейчас находится действительно в серьезной опасности, потому что давление со стороны государства уже с помощью принуждения судебных органов, оно стало беспрецедентным. И, глядя на все это, мы можем сделать один очень неутешительный вывод. Над Россией опускается ночь, над Россией опускаются все власти государственных карательных репрессивных органов. Мы видим, что нынешний российский режим – это тоже диктатура, которая, в общем-то, не такая, как советская, но это советская диктатура, вывернутая наизнанку, без коммунистических идей, но с приматом идей государственности и с приматом идей о том, что не государство для нас, а личность должна подчиняться интересам государства. Вот эта машина подавления, которая сегодня в России работает на полные обороты. И над Россией действительно опускается ночь. В России начинается торжество реакции. И мне очень хотелось бы, чтобы я был неправ, и чтобы все-таки гражданское общество оказалось сильнее этого государственного диктата. Спасибо и желаю успеха историкам, которые продолжают работать и продолжают бороться с идеологическими догмами и диктатом. Спасибо и вам успеха.
Now I would like to invite all our participants to the discussion. This event is co-organized. This event is co-organized by the Pilecki-Institut in Berlin and the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw. And the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw published recently a report by Domanska and Jadwiga Rogoza under the title Forward into the Past, Russia's Politics of Memory in the Service of Eternal Authoritarianism. And this report is also possible to download it at the website of Center for Eastern Studies. The authors, Maria Domanska, is a political scientist and analyst at the center, at the OSW Center. She is also the former diplomat in years 2012-2015. She headed the political department of the Embassy of the Republic of Poland in Moscow. And Jadwiga Rogoza is also OSW, so there's also the analyst of Center for Eastern Studies, where she deals with such topics as Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and also Russia. And she has also experience of work at the Polish embassy in Moscow. And we have, unfortunately, we mentioned that one of our commentators, Gabriele Wojdelko of Kerber Stiftung, didn't manage to come, but we have also other excellent participants of this discussion and commentator to these topics. Juliane Fürst is historian at Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, where she's deputy head and head of the research group Communism and Society. And I have to add that she's author of a very insightful, interesting book on Soviet hippies under the title Flowers Through Concrete, Explorations in the Soviet Hippie Land and Beyond, which was just recently published by Oxford University Press. And now, Maria and Jadwiga, the floor is yours. Please present the main thesis of your report.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today. Let me start with a short explanation what it is all about. What is so specific about Russia's politics of memory? Because All of us perfectly know that attempts to politicize historical issues are commonplace. They are commonplace even in consolidated democracies. But in authoritarian states like Russia, governments seek monopoly on shaping the desired version of the past. And they harness the entire institutional system of the state to protect these desired versions of the past, including the coercive apparatus of the state. But there is also something else about Russia, because in Russia there are three additional phenomena that further strengthen the authoritarian templates. First, it is the lack of established national identity, mainly because of a turbulent history of the 20th century. Secondly, these are the phantom pains after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And third, this is the unresolved trauma of the totalitarian legacy. What are the goals of Russia's politics of memory? First, the narrative of memory is meant to legitimize the authoritarian system of government as being optimal for Russia. And by this, it aims to perpetuate the model of state-society relationship that serves the Kremlin's interests, which are presented as national interests. Second salient goal is of the politics of memory is to legitimize the international image of Russia, Russia's great power interests, and its aggressive policy that is meant to implement these great power interests. The authorities follow the Soviet matrix of perceiving the country's history with many distinctly anti-Western features. And this stems from the fundamental importance of the Soviet era as the peak of Russia's international status over its history. And this is meant to help realize the Kremlin's desired vision of the contemporary international order. The Kremlin's permanent strategic interests include, first, obtaining Western acceptance of Russian hegemony in the post-Soviet area, and second, reducing American presence and influence in Europe. And when we hear President Putin, for example, or other Russian top officials talking about indivisible security or a non-bloc paradigm of international security, in fact, this is meant to present a very specific vision, to create a sort of a new Yalta order or a model of concert of powers, which is based on the division of spheres of influence between the strongest players and on a very specific concept of sovereignty, state sovereignty, because in their vision, full sovereignty is the attribute only of the strongest international players. And as we perfectly know, Russia also demands a right of veto as regards NATO or European Union enlargement in its so-called traditional sphere of influence. But still, why history is so important in Russia in the 21st century? The problem is that history is increasingly perceived by the authorities as the most important or powerful source of their legitimacy, while other factors of legitimization of this regime are waning. We should remember that the specific nature of the Russian political economic model makes it virtually impossible to find sustainable foundations for economic development. There is a tangible ideological void. There is a lack of vision for the future. And we also see the primacy of control over development in all spheres of functioning of Russian state. The authorities are also struggling with the lack of adequate language to describe contemporary Russia. Their rhetoric on state modernization, for example, rings quite false, and it creates strong dissonance with the rigid, ossified, centralized institutional model and with an economy that is consumed by systemic corruption. So the Kremlin is trying to fill this ideological void and attain legitimacy in the eyes of the society, not so much in a forward-looking approach, but in the resuscitation of the glorious past. And the Russian politics of memory is constructed in the spirit of what Timothy Snyder called the politics of eternity. It is based on a cyclical concept of history, on the myth of ever-returning moments of glory, martyrdom, and existential threats. I see 4 distinct features of the Kremlin-sponsored politics of memory, which, in my opinion, more deserves to be called historical propaganda, if we take into account the degree to which historical narratives are often distorted or overtly falsified. First, historical issues are extremely politicized, and certain historical events are even mythologized or sanctified. Secondly, history is securitized, which means that the desired interpretations of historical events are treated as an element of the state's existential security. As I've mentioned already, the entire institutional system of the state, including the law enforcement bodies and secret services, is engaged to shape and to protect the righteous historical narrative. Agencies like FSB, Ministry of Defense, or the Security Council are most active in this field. Russia is, in fact, waging what they call themselves a cognitive warfare against the West, while they repeat that this is the West that is waging a cognitive warfare against Russia. According to the official narrative, all the uncanonical, undesired interpretations of historical events are deliberately disseminated by Russia's enemies in order to undermine Russian national identity and in order to even destroy the state sovereignty, break Russia apart. The issue of countering the distortion of the past, the falsification of history, as they put it, this issue has been raised in the context of national security in a number of Russian strategic documents, including the military doctrine, for example. Third important feature is the militarization of history. Russia's official discourse is mainly about military victories over centuries and imperial expansion. And last but not least, and this feature is becoming more and more tangible over recent years, this is the Re-Sovietization of the historical narratives. This is about the content and the methods, because on the one hand, the official interpretations, mainly of the 20th century history, in many aspects return to the Soviet templates. I mean, the Soviet templates of the pre-Gorbachev era. And they are strongly anti-Western. But I would say that above all, this Re-Sovietization is tangible in the general atmosphere of curbing the freedom of historical research, in the ideological indoctrination of the school children, even children in kindergartens, because it starts at this early. And it is also visible in general atmosphere of secrecy. For example, it reveals itself in restricted access to the state archives. Also, criminal and administrative law are supposed to safeguard the desired monopolized version of the past events. Which elements of Russian official historical discourse are, in my opinion, the most important and most worrying? I see 2 examples of how history can be instrumentally used to justify aggressive foreign policy and oppressive domestic policy. First, this is the theme of the Great Patriotic War that has strong domestic functions also, because it is a path to glorify strongman rule and the very idea that this is not the state that is supposed to serve its citizens, but these are citizens who are supposed to make sacrifices in the name of the state. But for me, the Great Patriotic War is mainly instrumentalized, mainly used to justify Russia's great power ambitions. This myth, because it's strongly mythologized, this myth of Great Patriotic War is embedded into a broader imperial discourse about 1,000-year-old Russia. What is especially visible here is a sanctified victory over Nazism. And this sanctified victory is presented as the key event in the country's history. And it also constitutes a kind of a founding myth of Putinism. It is based on the idea of Russian messianism. And it leads to covering up dark chapters of the Soviet history. It leads to justifying the Stalinist terror and justifying the territorial annexations of 1930s and 1940s. And in this messianic narrative, Russia inherited from the Soviet Union the moral mandate of the only true opponent of Nazism, who saved the world from absolute evil and now, therefore, should have a strong say in shaping the European security system. The Soviet Union is presented as an innocent victim of aggression. So the first 2 years of the Second World War are totally absent in this narrative. What is also extremely important in this context is that the Great Patriotic War is something of an archetype of military operations conducted by Moscow, by Russia in the 21st century. And this has been used mainly, as we remember, in the anti-Ukrainian disinformation campaign of 2014 and later. This campaign aimed to prepare and justify the military aggression against this country. And Russia's actions were depicted from the very beginning as actions aiming to defend universal humanitarian values and to liberate the ethnic Russian population and Russian-speaking population from the alleged Nazi threat, which was in fact a liberal democratic threat. Also, in fact, the Brezhnev doctrine was revived at that moment. So if we compare this narrative about the war, the Great Patriotic War, in the context of the Second World War, and Russia's narrative in 2014, we see that both in 1939 and 2014, there worked the logic of sort of a forward defense, of strategic depth. I mean, imperial expansion in the name of national security. And the second extremely important topic, an extremely important example of the instrumentalization of history in the name of current authoritarian vested interests of the ruling elite, is an increasingly explicit affirmation or even glorification of the state security bodies. The Federal Security Service, the FSB, the Ministry of Interior, they openly proclaim themselves to be heirs to the Soviet security apparatus. The positive image of the KGB and KVD of Cheka, this positive image is promoted by pop culture, but also by top state officials. And the key message here is that both in the past and nowadays, the brave patriots from the KGB or FSB fought against foreign agents, terrorists, and enemies of the state. And of course, the role of NKVD in Stalin's mass terror, or the role of FSB and other law enforcement bodies in crimes committed against citizens in Putin's Russia, their role is whitewashed or justified, rationalized in many ways. And last point, there is also a clear desire to anonymize the victims of Stalin's mass crimes. And the primary aim of this policy is to devalue the role of individuals vis-à-vis the state and vis-à-vis the state power. The aim is to demonstrate that an individual is powerless in the face of history. An anonymous citizen has neither identity nor rights. And the anonymity of victims leads to the namelessness of executioners, and above all, to the institutional system of the state being absolved of crimes. For example, the names of the NKVD executioners, even those who died long ago, are removed from the archival documents. I mean, those documents that are still accessible, because the majority of them is not. And I read this policy as a sort of a clear promise to the successors of the Soviet security bodies, the successors from FSB, from the Ministry of Interior, who are currently involved in the persecution of Russian democratic opposition, that in return for their loyalty, Putin's Russia will give them the same unlimited guarantees of impunity as it gives to their predecessors from Soviet times. So this is roughly how I see the whole picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jadwiga.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here together with Maria. And my part of the report was devoted to society. And when it comes to the power, those in power, you can say explicitly what they mean, what they strive at, what the politics are. But with society, it's much more nuanced. It's much more complex. Sometimes very diverging processes go on in society. So I was trying to sum them up in the context of the policy memory. So what Maria already mentioned is this myth of war. And in fact, for the Russian society, it's the most important myth and icon, the Second World War or the Great Patriotic War, I have to stress. Because as it was said already, it's not the Second World War that is talked about in Russia, it's the Великая Отечественная война. So it's Great Patriotic War, starting from 41. And it has become a myth and an icon, and it's, of course, it's due to the efforts of the state. And what is important in this myth, what is distinct from the European memory policy, is that it's almost purely heroic. It's based on victory. It's based on the great superpower status of the USSR. And it does not contain, and practically does not contain, any tragic aspects. It does not speak about the war as the horrors of the war, the humanitarian tragedies, the ruin of the entire continent. So it's left behind the clauses. So it's purely a heroic act. It's the path to the victory, and the state is in the center, not the individual, but the state. And the state wins, the state fights, the state gains, and the tragedy of individuals is just left behind. But we have to admit that this kind of myth and this kind of narrative strongly resonates within the Russian society. And looking at the roots of this susceptibility, I look at Russian political culture. And Russian political culture historically, traditionally, has been centered around the state. That's one thing. The state was the primary subject, and the individual was always subordinated to the state. And the second, cult of war, cult of force, cult of violence was always present in different forms. It's very widespread. It's not satisfying the citizens, but it's kind of accepted. And this is also the difference between the Western cultures and Russian culture, because violence is accepted as a part of the culture. And it's embodied on very many levels. For example, it's the authority against the citizen, suppression of the citizen. It's the stronger against the weaker, in many respects. It's domestic violence, which is a huge problem in Russia. It's only starting to emerge as a public discussion today. Violence as a means of education, children upbringing. So many forms which are very present and kind of accepted, as I said. And one manifestation of this cult of war and cult of a strong state that we also mentioned in the report is the, like I would say, the comeback of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin is gaining respect, popularity, and about 75% of Russians admit that he was a figure, a historic figure, a strong statement that played a positive role in Russian history. And this is because of due to two factors. One is that one is the policy of the state, which is praising the strong leader who won the war at any cost, but the costs are left behind. So this is the figure of this winner, of a strong leader. But the second reason why Stalin is I wouldn't say popular, but is remembered with sentiment among some parts of Russian society is different and has some hint of protest, because people's frustration with today's low living standards, with corruption in the elites, make them remember with sentiment the icon figure who is created as this just leader, social justice, asceticism of the elites, the leader that cared about the people, was close to the people. Of course, it's a myth, but it's a myth that tends to come back somehow. And I have to make a reservation. People don't want to come back to Stalin's times. They don't want to live in those times. Only 5% Russians say in the polls that they would want to live in the Stalin's era. But it doesn't stop them from remembering those times and picking some aspects from the rule of Stalin with fondness, as opposed to today's corruption and actually wild capitalism of the Russian state, a lack of welfare, a lack of social support. Why these trends are so deeply rooted in the Russian culture? I would have to also point what Maria mentioned, that it's been instilled in people's minds from the early childhood. So we have some kind of formal or informal upbringing program or a way of bringing children from the kindergarten. And they sing patriotic songs. They are told about heroes. They march. They have uniforms. And it continues in school, in the university. You have textbooks that speak about these great patriotic acts. But also you have teachers and parents that preach the children what they think is this eternal way of things that you cannot overthrow, that there's no alternative to this eternal way of things, that the state is the super value in Russia, the state is strong, and the citizen always have to sacrifice himself or herself to the state. So children are really brought with this idea in mind, and that's why it's very deeply rooted later on. And even people who have democratic views, liberal views, they tend to, at some deep level, they tend to replicate these notions. And popular culture is also a powerful tool for shaping minds. And even though in Russia you will find a lot of art house films that are critical of the state of affairs, and they picture them sincerely and without this narrative, still the popular culture is very much strengthening those attitudes. And they are presenting them in this simplified, entertaining form. That's why it's easily absorbed by many people. So you have TV series, films, TV series about the war, about secret services of Russia. There's a lot of series about KGB, about FSB, about noble servicemen who saved Russia, who saved the world from this eternal enemy, eternal and external enemy. And very often it's pictured, it's not the war that is not going, that there's some border behind which this enemy is. Very often the war is going on in the country, and this front is invisible. And Russian security officers are called the fighters of the invisible front, because the enemy is also inside the country. So you can, if you know Russian, you can watch some series, and you will see how it's instilled. Russian Orthodox Church is another institution, formally independent, but actually through entire history of the church, with very little autonomy from the state. This is an institution that also strengthens this narrative. So this narrative is about the Russia being the successor of this 1,000-year history, successor of the victories, but also successors of all the systemic elements of the state. So you have the strong state, you have the leader, you have use of force, and you have people as subordinates. The church always legitimized secular power, and it's happening today as well. It's giving consent. It's kind of sacred legitimacy to even war operations. Not to speak about the rule of Vladimir Putin, because part of the president's coming to power is the mass in the church on the Kremlin, and some special blessing from the patriarch. So it is this sacrification of the secular power. And another narrative that also church fosters is that Russia is eternally distinct from the Western civilization. So it's very much strengthened that Russia is a different civilization. It has its own path of historic development, and therefore no Western values fit the Russian civilization. And what I want to finish with is that this picture, as I started, is not so unanimous or so simple. Even though the majority of people tend to support this narrative that I was speaking about, there is a group of people, predominantly of young generation, although not necessarily, who are interested in exploring and uncovering not the heroic past, not just this series of victories, but also these dark, tragic chapters, the chapters of the history of repressions. And they tend to explore not the history of the entire empire, of the entire Russia, but local histories. It's the history of their region, their town, their families. It's the tragic history of their grandfathers, who were victims of repressions, but very often also executors. And in one family, you can also find both victims and executors. And people are willing to speak about it, to uncover those facts. And they focus on costs of victories, not only on victories themselves, but also on costs of wars, on human costs. And this trend was called in Russia the second memory, as opposed to the first memory fostered by the state, this heroic imperial memory. You have the second memory, which is local, which is sincere about the human costs of this history. So I think it's also worthwhile to consider that. So I think I will stop here.
Many Thanks. I have already a few questions, but the first comment is Juliane. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for the report, which was hugely insightful and interesting and exhaustive. So I'll comment as a historian, which I think gives a slightly different perspective from political scientists, and I won't comment on all the aspects. There are so many aspects in the report. So I picked a few, and sometimes I summarize your argument, and sometimes I'll go a little bit beyond. And I grouped that into 4 points. One is the internal contradictions of the Russian historical memory politics. One is about omissions, because of course it's not only about what is said, but quite a lot about what is not said. And the third is about the idea of generation. I mean, different generational receptions. And then I have a little bit on musing about what are the turning points. When did that kind of manipulation of historical memory start? But I'm very glad that you actually started, Maria, with the observation that, of course, all states at all times are driving their own memory politics. It is a question of degree. But obviously, if you have a head of state, as Putin has done recently, issuing historical statements, and you know as a historian you suddenly have competition, you realize that these politics have entered a different state. I'm starting with the contradictions, because one of the things that is extraordinary in Russian politics of historical memory is that it manages to combine quite a few elements which actually seem to be opposites. And that's, of course, also a possible weakness, because at the moment it tries to cater to all sorts of communities by pretending there is no contradiction. But first of all, of course, as Vladimir Putin has said several times, I think only most recently a few days ago, the bemoaning of the collapse of the Soviet Union as a geographical and political catastrophe, and as you say, in essence, the sort of resurrection of a lot of Soviet values, norms, and commemorations as desirable, but at the same time promoting also an imperial idea, most clearly expressed by the extreme support for the Orthodox Church, which of course was not part of the Soviet Union, on the very contrary, was repressed itself. The worshipping of the imperial family, the also resurrection of aristocratic values, and of course the idea of a kind of empire, even though that term is always hotly disputed. But nonetheless, there's a lot of things running parallel, and they aren't really dissolved. And it's interesting that in the last few days, it seems like the Communist Party has finally come under pressure itself as an opposition force, which seems to suggest that possibly it's that part of history that's going to lose out. But on the other hand, there is so much, not only nostalgia would be the wrong word, but veneration of Sovietness, of things Soviet, even though, of course, they choose and pick, that it also still remains a big contender. And that really gets me to the second contradiction. The fact that, on the one hand, by keeping that Soviet narrative, of course, there's always an underlying promotion of a revolution, class equality, all the things the Russian Revolution once promised and maybe didn't quite deliver, but partially did, of course, deliver all the services, the lack of huge social differences. And at the same time, there is obviously a huge desire in the Russian state to keep the status quo. And the status quo, of course, also includes huge social differences which have been created since 1991. So again, on the one hand, there is this promotion of Soviet memory and of the Soviet Union, and on the other hand, there's an actual, at least a lack of criticism of the inequalities that exist as a result of the end of the Soviet Union. And the same goes sort of a little bit also for that sort of dichotomy of freedom and repression, that Russia is perfectly capable of casting itself already in its Soviet incarnation as defenders of freedom, and at the same time is handing out repression, and at the moment an increased repression. So you have that whole narrative, for example, about how Edward Snowden has been saved by Russia, but also when Black Lives Matters happened, sort of looking back at the anti-racist record of the Soviet Union, and at the same time you have the incredible persecution of the domestic media. So that in all of these promotions and historical castings, they're kind of dangers. And the same is true for casting Russia as a nation of peace, and then the increased military culture, and you have spoken about that very eloquently. And also the economic neoliberalism, which has come in since the 90s, and which of course is also now already part of history, and which is completely not talked about, while at the same time driving this extreme anti-Westerness. So there's also a contradiction in that on the one hand, the West is constantly bedeviled as non-spiritual, aggressive, and plain wrong, and at the same time there's absolutely no discussion that of course the economic model that was once imported from the West is alive and well in Russia and not really disputed. And then last but not least, and that's, I say that very much as a historian, there's a curious contradiction between what is happening on the scholarly side of history and on the sort of public history side. So on the one hand, you have all these laws forbidding a denigration of the Red and Soviet army. You have laws restricting of how can be talked about certain key points in Russian and Soviet history. And at the same time, you have at the Higher School of Economics a Center for War Studies, which does conferences with Western scholars, which de facto break all these laws by having extremely critical takes on certain things. And while, of course, quite a lot of the university landscape has been leveled too, there is still, I mean, I'm still frequently invited to Russia to give talks or to participate in conferences which actually are on the border of what we, I mean, certainly wouldn't be printable anymore, except maybe in Novaya Gazeta. So you have these little valves being left open, which can be pointed to say, but here you see, we have a free discussion about historical memory. And it makes it very difficult to catch that sort of slippery existence. My take on this is that I think that living with contradiction itself is a result and a legacy of the Soviet past, because of course this contradiction, for example, between being campaigning for peace and having an extreme military culture, that was already apparent in Soviet times. And I think Brodsky once wrote about this in his memoirs, where he said, well, as a little boy, of course I loved tanks and arms and weapons, and it was only when I emigrated and he sort of came in contact with the hippie movement that he realized that, of course, these are all instruments of war, and in a certain way directly opposed to the idea of peace. And of course, also that sort of downplaying of the revolutionary aspect of the Soviet Union versus a kind of status quo has a long tradition. I once wrote about the sort of commemoration of the Russian Revolution through the decades, and my part was 1977, and it's very interesting how 1977, the term revolution was basically not uttered, because Brezhnev couldn't think of anything worse than having a revolution, so he had to commemorate the revolution without actually glorifying the revolution. So I'll come quickly to omissions. I mean, the main omission, of course, is the fact that history is complex. And as I say, there is a certain contradiction between what is happening on the university scholarly level, where you have excellent scholars and really good history being written and produced, and sort of what is passed on in public history. The war had one meaning for everybody. And of course, in many ways, it is quite astonishing, because of course it's exactly that kind of policy which got the Soviet Union already in so much trouble, because by imposing that war narrative on Western Ukraine and the Baltic states, which had very different war memories, but also individuals. I mean, there was no war narrative for Ostarbeiter, for prisoners of war, etc. So there was a whole lot of people who were left, their subjective memory was left out of the official memory. And I always think that is one of the reasons of why the Soviet Union imploded in the end, because it didn't fit. On the other hand, of course, it's getting easier, because individual memory, of course, is dying out, and what is left is this big public memory. But nonetheless, and I think I found your discussion about the unforgotten regiment, where people go with the death of their relatives or the pictures of their dead relatives who have died in the war, rather than heroic slogans. That is already a sort of beginning of where there's a sort of, again, people become aware there's a cleavage between like how the war is remembered in these official publications and commemorations, and how they themselves see remember it as usually the destruction of a family. But it is true that, of course, the memory of the Great Patriotic War is one of the big support mechanisms for the current regime in Russian society. And of course, in Brezhnev's time, I mean, I find it very clearly that he has learned from that late socialist experience. The second omission, I think, which is interesting, and again, it's not absolutely clear-cut, but the way how these, what you call the tragic moments of Russian history are remembered, and I think Nikita Pietrow mentioned to it, nobody denies these days there was a terror of the 1930s, and nobody denies all the victims of collectivization. But it's basically a story of lots of victims and no agents. There are exceptions. As you mentioned in the report, there are people who have written books, and there has, of course, been some scholarly work on sort of Gulag employees, but nothing really commensurate with how many people actually are and were involved in these events, and possibly even in a sort of more complex way of recognizing that people could be victims and agents and actors. And of course, as long as there is this sort of very simplified look at the terror and other forms of repression, especially repressions of the later socialist period, where many more people are alive. I mean, frankly, of course, of the 1930s, there are practically only children who were children. But of the later period, when psychiatry and bureaucracy was frequently used to destroy people's existence and livelihood and sometimes even lives, that there's no real discussion of who was involved there, who were the psychiatrists, who were the people who worked in the prisons, who were the people who informed. And of course, it's a very painful process, as all nations know who have gone through that process of having to look through their Secret Service archives. And of course, there is no Secret Service archive. I mean, there is an archive, but it's not open, and except in bits in Ukraine and the Baltic states. And then I find interesting, a really interesting omission is there is no real talk about the history of Palestroika, which is, of course, that one moment where Russian historical politics did go a different way, and where it could have gone a very different way. And as in basically lumping it in with what's called the Lichie 90, the wild 90s or the cruel 90s, and completely tying it up both in personal and official memory with the destruction of economic livelihood. It's, of course, both the persona of Gorbachev, I think, has again been voted the most unliked person in Soviet history, and the whole period he represents, of course, remains in a strange nowhere land. So quickly coming to youth, or actually, I mean, I want to speak about old age and youth, and I think what one shouldn't forget is that, of course, the anti-Soviet narrative, which emerged in the 80s and 90s, and of course emerged particularly strongly in countries which wanted to distance themselves from their socialist past, including Poland, but also, of course, in all the other former states of the Soviet bloc, that, of course, did not ring well with a lot of people who had lived through it in the Soviet Union. It's very hard to be criticized, and it felt very personal. So I think that sort of counter-narrative the Russian state is providing feels very comfortable for a lot of people, because it more fits how they remember. They remember the Soviet times as a time of personal happiness, or of success, or of security, and of course the narrative of suppression and repression and colonization as it is emerging from now their neighboring states is seen as very threatening. So I think there's very good reason of why people of that older generation are not keen to buy into a narrative that is so personally uncomfortable. However, that is not necessarily true of young people, and I think it is really the young people one has to look to in order to see where will that public historical memory go. And I found that part of the report very interesting, partly because I'm a historian specializing on youth, and of course there's sort of the idea of youth both as the promise of the future, but also as this danger of subverting what you have achieved. That is also a Soviet legacy. And I think you see it with Putin completely clearly of how he is going after all these things which might attract young people, or how he himself, and I don't know if he did it personally, I'm just using it as a shorthand now, but if you remember a few years back, we had this organization, Nashi, which was very much supposed to be as a Komsomol replacement, and it's interesting, it kind of failed. I mean, I remember when I finished my first book, which was in the early 2000s, Nashi looked really good. It had lots of members and summer camps, and now it is nowhere. And who is now having the young people? It's Navalny, who, I mean, if you go and see the protests in Moscow when they were still happening, it's predominantly really young people, I mean, really young teenagers. So basically, I think the Russian state at the moment is in this perpetual moral panic about youth, which is going actually much further than just the politicization of youth. It's basically evaluating every cultural aspect of youth socialization to see if it possibly could be destructive. And of course, that also goes back into the 70s, where Soviet Union did not want to recognize for 10 years that there's something like rock music, or that they wanted to ban the Beatles, and it was all futile, really. I mean, they came anyway. People loved rock music, and they loved the Beatles. And you can see of how the Russian state at the moment is trying to drive this this small balance between keeping them out of Western harm, and yet still leaving the freedom in order not to create sort of major opposition. Yeah, and in terms of turning points, I was sort of wondering, and that I couldn't really see that so much in the report, and maybe it's asking too much. I was wondering, I mean, of course, as I say, I mean, there was a moment when it looked very different. I mean, Perestroika, one of the major pillars of Perestroika was that re-evaluation of history and the sort of incredible desire to learn what really happened. And when did it all change? And then I think, I mean, as a historian, of course, I like to go really far back. And I think, of course, to look at Brezhnev's time is very instructive, because I think Putin really is incredibly influenced by that part, because he was socialized in that era, and the modeling of taking the war as something that is deflecting away from domestic problems is, of course, a trope of Brezhnev's time. So I think the idea of the era of modeling the era of stagnation as something desirable is a really important moment. Then something which I didn't see in the report is, I think the Chechen wars were very important, not possibly for history, but because it broke that border between restricting press freedom. And I remember already in 2000, Putin had literally just been made president. There was this law that journalists were not allowed to report without censorship from the Chechen front, and I remember debating that with Russian friends, if this is the beginning of the end, and it seemed very far away. It seemed a minor detail at the time, but I think that was the first time the dam was broken again. I think a big moment was Assange and WikiLeaks. I think it's something where Russia looks very much for justification. That, of course, what they are doing is what the West is doing too, and I think it's a bit more than just a trope. I think it is a firm conviction. And then, of course, Ukraine and Belarus. Ukraine several times emancipating itself and including in this emancipation of having a counter-historical memory, and that's, of course, is quite worrying to have. As if you think that historical memory is so important, to have a state on your doorstep which is promoting a counter-narrative. That's much more worrying than in many ways something like Memorial, which, influential as it is still, of course, a minority organization, and of course, most recently Belarus, which hasn't toppled, but there's no doubt that large swathes of the population there also have a different historical memory. Anyway, thank you so much for writing this and being here.
Thank you, Juliane. So I give the voice to Maria and Jadwiga to react to this contradictions, omissions, and other comments by Juliane. But I also should ask the people in the audience if you have any questions, please think about it and signal the willingness of to ask. Maria, Jadwiga.
Yeah, I think it's for a very long conversation. I mean, to touch upon all your points, and thank you so much for your comments. Maybe I will just touch upon selected issues. As for the turning points for Russia's politics of memory, actually, well, it's of course again a long talk, but we presented a quite long chronological list of how it evolved under Putin. Actually, first signs of changes, something like withdrawal from the Gorbachev early Yeltsin line. Something like that happened already in mid-90s when security services and law enforcement bodies started to play a growing role in managing the politics of memory. At that moment, for example, what started was the gradual restriction of access to the archives. It started already back then, not under Putin. I think that what really changed under Putin was, first, a result of his broader philosophy of the state. I mean, he was determined to strengthen the state, to make Russia raise up from her knees and become great again. And many aspects of his various policies were subject to this overriding goal. Also, the politics of memory. This return to the imperial discourse was exactly an element of this broader strategy. Another direction or another source of the changes under Putin was the immediate reaction to the events that were taking place outside Russia. For example, the OSCE, as far as I remember, resolution of 2009 about totalitarian systems. In this same year, Medvedev set up the commission to counter the falsification of history. So it was like tactical reactions. Also, the first signs of this new politics of memory was already in 2002, 2003, where Putin for the first time sent a signal to the historians and to the history teachers that the approach to history should be more patriotic, and the authors of school textbooks shouldn't follow the line of Western grant givers in presenting Russia's history. So then, 2007, another address, Putin's address to the history teachers. The same year, he addressed the international community in the famous Munich speech. So there are some common points in that, but of course, the crucial period for forming the current Russia's politics of memory was the third presidential term of Putin, and it was provoked by what happened in Moscow in 2011-2012, mass protests against Putin. It was exactly that moment when he realized that apparently, within his logic, the state and the regime needed something new, some more powerful propaganda, some powerful ideology to counter the adverse events, adverse developments, because at that moment I think that he started to feel insecure about his future power. As for Chechen wars, I'm absolutely aware that we just weren't able to touch upon all interesting topics, and also there is a huge topic that was left beyond the scope of our report. I mean, the whole issue of federal center regions, the relations between the federal center and the regions in the field of history, because we have anti-colonial narratives in some Russian regions. But again, the report has over 100 pages already, so we had to carefully choose. Dziękuję. You also mentioned an extremely interesting, I would say even fascinating topic of how eclectic, how inconsistent is the current Russia's politics of memory. Because we may like the Soviet ideology or not, but it was consistent, it was cohesive, it was logical. Putin's politics of memory is eclectic, and a great example of this is how the revolution as a founding myth for the Soviet era is ignored or bypassed, carefully bypassed in current Russian propaganda. You said that nobody denies that the mass terror took place.
I thought that Nikita said that.
Yeah. I mean, it is changing. I mean, yes, no one denies it took place, but I would say that it's more and more often that this terror is presented as something justified, and that only either corrupt nomenclatura or criminals were persecuted by brave patriots from the NKVD. And we see it clearly in how the discourse about the Katyn massacre evolved over years, for example. In the 90s, no one denied that, yes, the Soviet Union was responsible for this unprecedented crime. Now, officially, no one denies it was NKVD and the Soviet Union. But Kremlin doesn't prevent certain very specific figures to overtly express an opinion that actually the version that it was the responsible of the Soviet Union was a part of Goebbels' propaganda. So it's not that this is the Kremlin that openly states such things, but it is presented on the margins of the official mainstream. But again, for many reasons, it is perceived as something welcome in some sense. I mean, my general idea is that the main goal of this whole propaganda, of this whole falsification of history, is not as much to convince the whole world that Russia is right in its arguments about history, about what happened, but it is within the more general line of promoting the post-truth as a method of general eroding of collective mentality, collective understanding of what happened in history, because this would be the fertile ground to sow Russian disinformation, for example. So I think that, that's what I particularly liked about your comment, and thank you again. Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you for the fresh eye, because the report was not only exhaustive, but also exhausting. And I will touch upon two things, the youth and Ukraine. With the youth, it's just as complicated as with the society. And I would dare to say that the generation change itself does not change the inner convictions. We see young people who use technical progress, who use internet, who have gadgets, but very often their convictions are quite, they resemble the convictions of their fathers, grandfathers, etc., teachers. So, and I've met young Russians, well-off, educated, who traveled to Europe, and they would come to Poland or to Germany, to whoever, and argue how correct this Soviet or post-Soviet vision of history is. So it doesn't come automatically, I would say, with time, with progress, technical progress, and unfortunately, I can see a group of very young, active, critically thinking people, but there are too few of them. It's not a critical mass, as with Russian opposition. Russian opposition is really brave and very liberally oriented, but it's not a critical mass. And each time the protests grow, the government succeeds in suppressing them. And I'm afraid it's happened it's just happened for another time. So. So I watch those young people with Memorial. It's an interesting thing that Memorial is rather an organization made by people from the currently middle-aged generation. But their sons, actually the son of one of the Memorial founders, Grigory Okhotin, he founded some new NGOs in Russia, Over the Info, which is very important, which monitors also violence at opposition rallies, etc. So you can see that you have young people who catch this flag and go on. But as I said, it's not enough to make the change in Russia. And with Ukraine, yes, of course, we can speak volumes of Putin's narrative, who wants to blur the difference between Russian and Ukrainian nations, of course, to present the Ukrainian nation as a younger brother, but still like almost a twin brother. So distinctiveness of Ukraine is being blurred in many ways, but an Orthodox Church has done a lot here, and I mentioned in the report that for Orthodox Church, the autocephaly of Ukrainian Church was a particular blow, and it was employed a lot of I would say weapons in brackets to oppose the autocephaly, because this is emancipation of Ukraine on another level. I can see that Ukraine is being emancipated on this church level, on society level very visibly, on the memory policy level also very visibly, because in Ukraine, and it's quite revolutionary for a post-Soviet country. In Ukraine, the end of the World War, the Second World War, is celebrated not only on the 9th of May, but also on the 8th of May, when Europe celebrates. And memory policy is more and more resembling the European model of memory, which is concentrated on the war as this humanitarian catastrophe, of tragedy of people. Not only this great victory. So Ukraine is really doing a lot, and I think it's maybe controversial to say, but the war with Russia actually pushed Ukraine out and away from this post-Soviet way of thinking, also in the memory policy. And they are now searching for this European model, and they are still in progress.
Juliane?
Just a very quick reply on the youth. I actually, what I meant to say was not that there is going to be a huge political wave. On the contrary, I'm very well aware of how few. But I think what is interesting, I sense there is also, on the other hand, a lack of active support, and there's a sort of escape into what is perceived as apoliticalness, but which, of course, in a state that is so politicized as Russia is these days, and as the Soviet Union was as well, all these things could be potentially dangerous. So, I mean, in a very small scale, for example, only recently, something called Our has been declared a terrorist organization. It's not even clear there is an organization. It's basically a phenomenon. It's a subculture among not so well-to-do youth who worship the criminal underworld, which also has a huge legacy in the Soviet Union and already in Russia, the sort of thieves, the official thieves, and the jargon that goes with it, and the song and the blood, and anyway, I mean, that this has been criminalized and has been labeled an organization I found very interesting, because it is really straight out of the Soviet rule book of basically moral panics of things which could be classified as kids' game to a certain extent, but then become politicized. And the gradual shutting down of social media services, the slowing down of things like Twitter, and the taking over of Kontakte, and all of that, I think it's encroaching into worlds of young people which they don't actually perceive as political, but which are now become political because of the way they're being encroached on.
Allow me please one sentence. Yes, I agree, but I would say that the state is now persecuting or trying to control this movement, young people movement, based on use of force among peers, to put it shortly. Just because it was out of control. And the same happened with Russian nationalists. The Russian nationalists, even those who supported this notion of Russia as an empire, they were too autonomous, and at some point they also became the subject of repressions, of attempts to gain control. Many nationalists went to prison. So whatever is, even if it kind of resonates with the state ideology, but is not dependent on the state, is autonomous, is acting kind of from, how to put it, is acting in a grassroots way. This is dangerous for the state, and I think this is a kind of attempt that we have to look at all the time. That the state has to be in control with many spheres of Russian life.
I would ask a question. So one question about this internal dimension of using history. So because if we look at democracies, generally speaking, we can say that that politicians use history in order to mobilize their voters. So they want people to vote for them. And what is the situation in Russia? So this is the question from outside, so to say. So does Vladimir Putin really have an electorate? So at all? So I mean, but does he should or has he used the history because he wants to mobilize their voters? Does he have an electorate in the sense we observe it in many democratic countries, or not? So what is this function, internal function of in that sense? So can we say that more people vote for Putin because of this narrative of history, or not? So this is one question about this internal dimension. So about this external, you all mentioned that this heritage of Soviet times. And what about this imperialism? I mean, but can we distinguish between this legacy of imperial times and imperialism in Eastern Europe from the heritage or legacy of the Soviet times and Soviet upbringing? So this is this question about this external dimension or legitimacy or justification. But and the last one is about what would you say is your report rather optimistic or pessimistic? I mean, do you see any change in horizon, or rather think it's okay? So this way of doing things in Russia, so and way of legitimacy or way of justification with usage of history is so strong, so stable that there's more stability and passivity in the society. So I don't understand. I didn't understand exactly what are, so from your Jadwiga certain remarks. What are exactly the results, for example, of public opinion surveys in Russia, so on this issue. So does this, we talked about youth, but generally speaking, so is Russian society, with one short sentence of answer, so relatively ready for change and ready to contest this narrative formed by the state, or rather passive, and we would say that these attitudes are along the lines proposed by the state.
Start this time shortly. Okay, I will speak shortly, maybe simplifying very much because we don't have so much time. If Russian society was left alone, I think it would evolve gradually and emancipate from this kind of narrative. But it's not. So whatever is deeply rooted is constantly reinforced by the state, in the state's interest. That's why it's not the void that if Russian society was only evolving along the lines of technical progress, of some globalization trends, on some social trends globally, then I am more than sure that there are some traits in the Russian society that it would really be transforming gradually. But they live in Russia. They are constantly subjected to propaganda, to put it shortly, and there's this compensation mechanism working for Russian citizens, that if you have low living standards, and now I want to remind you that since the war with Ukraine started, I call it Russia's war with Ukraine, not the war in Ukraine, living standards of Russian citizens are decreasing year by year since 2014. So this is the compensation mechanism working. If you are not well off, if you are insecure vis-à-vis the state, if you are frustrated with many things, also with how the state treats you, you need to look for some kind of compensation. And this great power, superpower status and great victorious history is a compensation mechanism. So it's Russian people live in this kind of atmosphere. They have this popular culture. They have their peers and fathers, grandmothers who are usually bringing children up, and the grandmothers tell them each day, don't go against the stronger ones. You have to be obedient. The state is everything, and the individual is nothing. If you hear this day by day, you kind of live with this in the heart. So it's not the void. And I just want to add one sentence to this. You asked about the legacy of the Soviet past versus the imperial past. Well, actually, I think the state produces the hybrid of different eras, historic eras, taking from each era what is useful, what goes along the interest, and that is the notions of a strong state, which and the society as a subjected to the state. So this is the chorus that goes along Russian history, and this is what unites Soviet past and the Tsar's past.
Just very briefly. I agree with Jadwiga on this point about imperial legacy. I think that it's all like united in one broader discourse, and the overriding aim is to show the continuation of the state structures and the continuation of 1,000-year-old Russian statehood. So in this sense, it's not much important whether it's purely Soviet or pre-Soviet. It just serves the same function. Optimism or pessimism? I think that, well, on the one hand, I agree that people are subject to constant, like, brainwashing, and it would be extremely difficult to break free from this paradigm. And in the report, I even used the metaphor that in a situation where the society is politically disenfranchised, the map as a material expression of the might of the state has sort of replaced the ballot as the material expression of the citizens' political agency. And to a certain extent, of course, it works. On the other hand, it's not in the field of history, it's in the field of absolutely contemporary issues. We've been observing over the recent years constant growth of anti-government sentiments, of disillusionment of citizens due to the dysfunctional political, economic, social model. So I think that in this context, the crude, indigestible propaganda, and I'm pretty sure that the youth see this propaganda as precisely crude and indigestible, that could add somehow to these broader anti-government sentiments and the growing demand for change, for something fresh, for something new, for some reforms, not necessarily fundamental ones, but for some prospects for future, for some social lifts for young people, which are blocked, in fact, in Russia, which contributes further to this broad disillusionment. Your first question, do people vote for Putin because of history? I'm not sure, but my intuition is that partially yes, but mostly indirectly, because the historical discourse stirs up syndrome of the besieged fortress. And Russia as a state that remains under constant threat, that is constantly threatened by the enemies, and in this narrative, the enemy has always come from the West. So if people get convinced that the state is a besieged fortress and needs strongman rule in order to save people, save the nation, save the state, yes, this historical discourse contributes to this approach. But I don't think that people wake up in the morning every day and think about history. It's not this case. So again, if it works in non-obvious ways and more indirectly than directly.
So maybe somebody would like to ask the question.
Thank you very much. Can I take off the mask when speaking? Yeah, okay. Two remarks and questions. First, I would like to add to the question of how the youth, the attitude of the youth. And I mean, obviously there is much opposition or contempt or whatever, especially the youth towards Putin. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this oppositional feelings include a critical stance towards the historical view. You know, like even Navalny himself. I mean, I know it's a very controversial question, if and to what extent he has changed, but he started out as a radical nationalist. And he concentrates his whole campaign on corruption, on the question that Putin and his folks are thieves, you know. And he does more or less, as far as I can tell, he totally leaves out questions of international politics. For example, the annexation of Crimea, I don't know if he even supported it, but he never really questioned it. So this, I mean, just the point that obviously opposing Putin or being hostile to Putin does not necessarily mean that you are critical towards this historical construction of that is presented in this nationalist and imperial terms. And another question maybe, can you tell to what extent this fabrication or rewriting or reconstruction of history is directed to the own society, more or less as a means of power to control the own society, and to what extent it is meant to disorient and confuse and distract the West and the discourses in the West. One example, obviously to say that the Soviet Union was a savior of mankind, of fascism, anti-fascism, that's an old-style Soviet paradigm. But what is new, for example, in Putin's argumentation, is that he poses as the greatest fighter against anti-Semitism, and the Soviet Union as the savior of mankind, of anti-Semitism, and of the Holocaust, as ending the Holocaust. You remember his performance at Yad Vashem, you know, and he's trying to denounce like the Ukrainian independence movement, or the Poland was the last one, as anti-Semites. They are anti-Semites, and although obviously the Soviet Union never fought anti-Semitism in a special way in the Second World War, and the Holocaust wasn't even allowed to be mentioned in Soviet times as a special crime independent of the war thing. So this is obviously directed towards to confuse the West, because he knows that in the West anti-Semitism and the Holocaust is a very sensitive point, and he uses this in order to turn around discourses. So maybe how much is it also as a mean of hybrid warfare directed towards the West? Thank you.
Thank you. So does anybody else wants to ask the question? Okay, so so we collect now the questions, and the last voice is...
So thank you. I don't think I have a clear question articulated, but I'll really try. I'm from Georgia, and I study in Berlin, and I wanted to ask, I mean, only a couple days ago, Putin repeated his famous 2007 Munich statement that the borders of the USSR should be rebuilt. And we saw this in 2008 in Georgia, and then we saw it in Ukraine. And both times what followed was what is in my region understood as the silence of the West, with no real response or opposition to Russia's expansionary politics. So I think what my question is, although I fully agree with this type of like falsifying history and rewriting it in their own ideological ways, I guess my question is, to what extent has this become more than a tool of like passive ideology, history as a tool of passive ideology, its shift to more weaponized tool, because for Ukraine and Georgia, this is, you know, real life. It's not just ideological, historical warfare. It is an actual warfare, hybrid, or in other senses, very physical. So I don't know if my question is clear, but I want to ask, how has history moved from a tool of oppression and tool of somehow like passive ideology to a weaponized, very active tool in people's lives?
Thank you very much. And the last round of answers, please. Who wants to?
Thank you for very interesting questions. You hit the nail on the head, because I also am convinced that it's not just about Putin. this entire narrative is older than Putin, and it will survive Putin, and it's something, if it wasn't so deeply rooted, it wouldn't be so effectively used. What I can see today is that Putin has been there for more than 20 years. He's getting older. He's more and more obsolete and I don't know, archaic. He doesn't stick to obsolete, modern expectations of many people, even from his own elite. But actually, it's not for me the question when Putin is going to leave. He will at some point. But the question is, what kind of change can we expect? I have an impression that majority of Russians, I don't consider now the Russian opposition this small part of the society, but the majority of Russians would want to have another Putin, but better, younger, a little bit more progressive, more modern, but more or less the better one, but the better younger version of the same. They are not ready to give up those eternal values. And among those values, there is an imperial status of Russia and a strong state. And I'm afraid it's not going to live with Putin. About the Holocaust, yes, exactly. And I think Putin uses, of course, historical narratives for both domestic purposes and foreign purposes. And on a foreign ground, he combines or he uses either Holocaust narratives or Christian values narratives, because a very strong process of showing firstly, accusing Europe of having lost their Christian values and being drowned in decay, moral decay. And second, offering mostly right-wing groups in Europe the offer of uniting under the flag of some Christian values. Of course, as with Stalin, it's a myth and it's a cynical one, because looking at Russian ruling elite, they are so far from Christian values in many respects. But it's at least in political terms, yes, it's a good tool to counteract the European values and narratives. And one last question about the hybrid war. Of course, we are talking about history, and history is happening. And when I'm asked today, also by my German colleagues, do you think the war will start? I'm saying the war is going on. The war hasn't ended, and we saw how the military acts were accompanied by very powerful, very emotional, and a very strong historical rhetoric. But this rhetoric was supposed to, of course, to justify the actions. How what Maria said, how Russia was explaining its actions in Donbass with the need to defense of the peaceful population against some kind of fascist political groups from Kiev. So we can see that it's being merged. It's being merged. Russia is acting with very many instruments. And of course, historical instruments, narratives are only just one of the entire portfolio. Of course. And we can talk about corruption as another tool. We could talk about gas being another tool of also political influence, etc., etc. So you can see, or Russian culture as also a soft power tool. So of course, the empire has a lot of tools at its disposal, and unfortunately also the military instrument being used.
You asked about Navalny and his stance on history and foreign policy, Actually, Navalny has commented a couple of times on the annexation of Crimea, and he never supported it. He overtly stated that it was an unlawful act and a violation of the international law. But then he demonstrated extremely pragmatic approach, saying that we should stop dreaming about that it's possible to just give Crimea back to Ukraine just like that. So a new solution will need to be worked out. And this man who almost never commented on foreign policy, but focused on corruption and other domestic affairs, in the late 2020, gathered around 20% of supporters in Levada Center surveys. 20% of people who declared that they support Navalny. In the conditions of the authoritarian regime and in the conditions of full media blockade of Navalny. So this is a glimmer of hope that I see in the whole picture, that not necessarily people will focus in the future on imperial discourse if someone comes who will be able to offer them some prospects of domestic development. Yes, historical lies are an important element of the hybrid warfare, and yes, they serve to confuse the West. These accusations of anti-Semitism addressed to Poland, for example, it serves to discredit, in the eyes of the West, discredit these states that are able to debunk Russian historical myths, and then also to counteract Russian contemporary great power ambitions. And Poland is one of the states that has a potential to counteract Russian great power ambitions, and we see it in, for example, in our role in strengthening the NATO eastern flank. So that's why we are so exposed to their propaganda. Just to illustrate a bit how they present the Holocaust and how they position themselves in this whole issue of Holocaust. In January 2020 in Jerusalem, Putin mentioned in one sentence, after comma, he stated that the Holocaust and the siege of Leningrad were two of the most tragic events of the Second World War. So this is how this discourse is being constructed. And the question of our Georgian colleague. Yes, history evolved into some kind of another active measure, sort of preparation of information campaign that serves to prepare an active phase of military aggression. But again, it's nothing new, in fact, because this is as old as the world is. I mean, every war always needed some kind of information preparation. But I think that the problem is that some years ago we still thought that another war in Europe is just impossible. So I think that Russia caught us off guard in this sense, and unfortunately, a Georgian experience of 2008, this lesson wasn't learned, and this lesson repeated in 2014, and is repeating every day since then. And you are perfectly right that the response of the West is very insufficient. But we have what we have, unfortunately, and I think this is a topic for another and a very long discussion, how the West should react to all of this.
Juliane.
It feels wrong that I should now have the last word, so I hope you will say something afterwards, especially since I might say something controversial, but I want to speak to your very interesting point about that trip about anti-Semitism and the Soviet Union as a savior. And then, of course, to a certain extent, Putin does have a point. The Red Army or the Soviet Army liberated Europe at great personal loss to the Soviet Union. We still don't know what the number of war dead is, but 27 is the absolute minimum that's now being counted. And of course, there was never an exterministic anti-Semitic policy in the Soviet Union as there had been in Nazi Germany. So that's one. And the other one, of course, is that Putin is very shrewd. I mean, he sees where the soft spots are. And the truth is that, of course, at the moment, it's not only Russia that is struggling with historical memory. And of course, in the Ukrainian case, OWN has a dodgy history, but its relationship to the local Jewish population is concerned, and the refusal, or at least the official refusal to address that, is of course giving a soft flank to these kind of interpretations Putin is going to make. And of course he's not only addressing that to the domestic one, even probably not to the domestic audience, but to the international one. One is confusion, but also he knows he has sympathizers because the discourse is varied and nuanced, and if he hits on something where basically there's a soft flank, of course there are some people who say, look, he's making sense, and then this one making sense can be extended to him making more sense more generally, and that's of course how RT works. RT takes moments which make sense and extends them to general truth.
Thanks. So we have to finish.
Just not to be misunderstood, of course, it's not to deny that the Soviet Union has a tremendous part of liberating or whatever Europe from National Socialism. But the new point is that Putin claims they liberated the Jews and saved them from being exterminated. And this, of course, did not play any role in the Soviet ideological orientation in the war to liberate the Jews, you know. So this is a new point that he's trying to construct. And it's in the West, it's a very strong argument that they liberated Auschwitz, you know. But of course, they did not liberate Auschwitz because they had any sympathy for Jews. They just liberated because it was on the way to Europe. But he now constructs now that the Soviet Union intended to liberate the Jews, although in the Soviet Union, in reality, it was not even possible to mention the Holocaust as a special crime, you know. And of course, the Soviet Union itself had not exterminated, not an exterminating sense of Jews, but it's a strong anti-Semitic trend in itself.
But not an exterministic one, and in the end they did liberate Auschwitz, if for whatever intentions they did do it. So, I mean, we would open a completely new discussion here also about the very interesting topic of how is the Holocaust remembered in the Soviet Union, which is also not quite as simplistic as it was never a topic. It was usually merged into that sort of commemoration of victims of fascism, etc. But there's also grassroots, and I mean, we have the 1956 poem by Yevtushenko on Babin Yar, etc., which there are moments. But anyway, I mean, that. Yeah,
it was, as it was said, so there are topics for new discussions, and maybe as a last sentence, so I would ask about the situation, about the persecution of memorials, or what is the situation now, because there's something going on. So maybe Maria or Jadwiga, so do you observe this situation? So.
Memorial actually has two trials, and one of them is today. And I don't know the results of this trial yet today, but generally it seems that the state is seriously determined to block even that work that Memorial was doing. And I have to say that Memorial in Russia is very respected. It's old organization with people who are really renowned historians, but it's only for the chosen ones. Their work is welcomed in Poland and many countries, but in Russia only a handful of people really know about the findings of Memorial. But still it's an institutionalized force, and as with many institutionalized forces that are not under control of the Kremlin, they one by one they are being subjected. And I'm afraid that this time the state is seriously seriously determined to at least stop the main stop the work of memorial mini fields, as happened with other organizations. So, but as Nikita said, I would like to be mistaken. And I hope that in some form, and I'm pretty sure that even if some forms of operation become impossible in Russia, as with other NGOs, those people will still keep doing that and waiting for the time when they can continue under the official banner, because they are people of passion, and Nikita is one of them.
The outcome of today, by the way, was that there's going to be a decision probably on December 23rd, another day in court.
Well, these are two issues within one issue. I mean, we have motion of prosecutor's office to close down the International Memorial Society, which deals primarily with Stalinist terror and research into the mass terror. And we have the Human Rights Center Memorial, which deals with more contemporary issues and publicizes the main effects of political persecution in Putin's Russia. So if I would assess the chances, the odds of closing down every of these two organizations, I think that the Kremlin and the whole state apparatus is quite determined to close down the Human Rights Center Memorial, and it's like 100% decided already, for purely domestic contemporary reasons, while maybe the International Memorial Society has like 5%, stands like 5% chance of not being closed down, or not being closed down in immediate future, let's say, because it wouldn't be anything new to employ sort of a salami tactics. I mean, to curb not all the freedoms at once, to carry out not a total crackdown on everything, but just step by step. So I cannot exclude this option, and it would be also maybe done a sort of a calculation just to send a signal, okay, we will fight in a very harsh way with all our political opponents, while others may feel safe if they don't meddle too much into contemporary political issues. And also maybe it would be calculated as a sort of certain signal, certain sign addressed to the West that, okay, you may be unhappy about closing down the Human Rights Center, but you should be happy that we are not going to close down memorials, so let's stop this debate. I think, I'm trying now to analyze their logic as I see it. So, but anyway, we are witnessing a very dark situation in Russia, and in the next years, as in 2024, there will be presidential election, and the regime already knows that its legitimacy will be waning further. So I think we can expect further repression, and hopefully we will not see any kind of a Belarusian scenario, but I can't exclude even that if the regime feels insecure, seriously insecure. So, yeah, and now we can come back to your question about how the West should react, but as I've said, it's for another discussion.
Many thanks. Fingers crossed for colleagues in Russia. And Maria Domanska, Jadwiga Rogoza, Juliane Fürst, many thanks. And many thanks also to you for your question and for your interest. Thank you.